Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Wishing you all a truly peaceful day. Today we're stepping into an incredibly intense episode that is guaranteed to be a tear-jerker. What will the proud CEO James do when all hope of finding Diep and their unborn child in this unfamiliar fishing port is almost completely crushed? And the moment that rundown boarding house door is pushed open, will the tears of a lovesick man be enough to make up for all the agonizing pain Diep has been enduring? But before we find out the answer, please take a quick second to leave a comment letting me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I truly appreciate all your love and support. And now, find a quiet, cozy spot, and let's step right into the eye of the storm in today's episode. The southern sky collapsed into a pitch-black, thick, and suffocating darkness. The summer storm brought powerful gusts of wind sweeping in from the open sea, howling through the trees and knocking over crooked signs along the highway. Inside the quiet cabin of the SUV, the only sounds were his heavy, choked breathing and the wipers working frantically to clear the pouring rain. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The car sliced through the thick mist, its tires gripping the slippery road with sheer determination. The roar of the engine echoed through the blinding white rain, as if trying to unleash the fire burning inside his chest. The fishing port in the southern coastal district. That vague, fragile clue repeated in his mind like a mantra. He didn't know exactly where she was in that massive area. He didn't have a specific address or a phone number to reach her. He only knew one thing. At the end of this stormy road, the woman he loved was enduring agonizing morning sickness all alone, just to protect their unborn child. After over 2 hours of staring intently past the wheel, the car finally slowed down, turning heavily onto the dirt path leading to the port. The rundown scenery emerging through the rain made James's chest feel like it was crushed by a boulder. Before him was a shabby shanty town with rows of dilapidated, rusted tin-roofed houses crammed together along the embankment. The road beneath was a sludgy mess of mud, and the sharp, salty smell of seawater stung his nose. James pushed the car door open. He didn't even bother grabbing the umbrella tossed in the back seat, stepping straight out into the pouring rain. Squish. His leather shoes sank deep into the black mud, splashing dirty water all the way up his light khaki pants. His polo shirt was instantly soaked, clinging to his tense muscles and letting in the bone-chilling cold of the ocean wind. But James couldn't care less. The man's heart was clenching in agony. The woman he cherished more than anything was holding her pregnant belly, gritting her teeth through the harshest days of her life in a place this dark and freezing. He took off. His long legs took hurried strides along the row of rusty, falling apart tin houses by the water. Rain poured down his face, stinging his eyes as he desperately scanned every corner. "Excuse me, sir," James yelled, trying to drown out the howling wind as he stopped a middle-aged man pulling a tarp over some fishing gear on his porch. "Could you please tell me, have you seen a skinny young woman who's pregnant? She just moved here to rent a room." The man paused, looking at the soaked young man with cloudy eyes. His gaze swept from the watch peeking out of James's sleeve to his sharp, unfamiliar face. People in the fishing village were tight-lipped and highly suspicious of anyone who looked like they were from the city. "I don't know. Dozens of people come here to rent and work with the fish every day. Who's got time to remember if someone's pregnant or not?" he grumbled, giving a blunt answer before turning around and slamming the wooden door shut, leaving James rooted in the rain. James gave a small nod of thanks, swallowing a tired sigh. He quietly choked down the bitter lump in his throat and kept walking, knocking on every shoddy rental door and stopping random passers-by rushing out of the rain. Ma'am, please, is there a girl named Diep around here? In her 20s, pregnant? Never seen anyone like that around here, kid. This place is a revolving door of laborers. I'm up to my neck in work. I don't have time to notice. A woman selling porridge shook her head. Her hands kept swiftly chopping green onions, avoiding his soaked, pleading eyes. Rain mixed with sweat streamed down his sharp jawline, seeping into the salty corners of his mouth. Hours dragged on. James's legs were giving out, having scoured almost every inch of the port road. The rain fell harder, whipping painfully against his face. But the freezing weather was nothing compared to the panic and helplessness slowly eating away at his heart. His chest ached in waves. His breathing was ragged. The world out there was so vast. So why did he lose her in this cramped, miserable place? In this damp, dilapidated corner, how could a frail, pregnant girl like her survive these stormy nights? Exhausted, broken, and practically drowning in despair, James stumbled toward the small market tucked away behind the port intersection. It was a cramped market squeezed right in the middle of the fishing village. Despite the thunderstorm, the seafood stalls were still bustling. The air was thick with the raw smell of fresh seafood mixed with damp earth. The sound of vendors calling out to each other and scattered bargaining blended with the squishy rolling of styrofoam carts on the wet pavement. It all created a rushed, chaotic rhythm of making a living, completely alien to his usually quiet world. James dragged his feet down the narrow aisle, letting the ice carts bump into his elbows. His heart felt completely frozen. And then, amid the crowd of people huddled in raincoats, pushing and shoving under flimsy tarps, James stopped dead in his tracks. His chest hitched, his eyes locked dead ahead. Less than 30 feet away, hidden next to a fish stand, was a tiny figure leaning over to pick out groceries. The heavy rain and prolonged exhaustion blurred James's vision. In that moment, the low ponytail, the skinny shoulders hunched against the cold, and that hard-working posture. It all combined to play tricks on the eyes of a man at the absolute end of his rope. James's heart skipped a beat, then pounded like it was going to burst. His desperate craving to find Diep was so overwhelming it robbed him of all rationality. It had to be her. It just had to be. Ignoring everything else, James practically lunged forward. His large, trembling hands reached out, wrapping around those frail shoulders from behind with extreme care and sorrow, as if terrified the illusion would vanish. "Diep, I finally found you." His voice cracked, heavy with all his pent-up emotions and pain. But the moment his arms touched her, the woman jumped. She whipped around in a panic, backing up so fast she dropped her plastic basket onto the ground. "Oh my God, what are you doing? You've got the wrong person." A completely unfamiliar face stared back at him. The woman's eyes were wide with fear and confusion as she looked at the soaked, strange man standing frozen in front of her. James stood dead still in the middle of the crowd. Vendors stopped chopping their fish, and housewives turned to point, throwing him suspicious and defensive glares. James stood dead still in the middle of the market. His arms dropped to his sides, freezing, numb, and empty. The truth was a fatal stab, piercing the last fragile shred of hope that had just flared up in his heart. The rain kept pouring down, washing away the mud on him, but it couldn't wash away the crushing disappointment dragging him down to rock bottom. It felt like God was punishing him for failing to protect the woman he loved. So now he was doomed to see her shadow in everyone he looked at. I'm sorry. I mistook you for someone else." His voice was dry and hollow. The apology fell from his pale lips like an involuntary reflex from a soulless body. He didn't care about the whispering and gossiping around him. He turned and walked away. The once tall, proud back of the powerful man was now slumped, exhausted, soaked, and pathetically alone amidst the chaotic crowd. Bone-tired, James trudged out of the noisy market. His mind was completely blank. He needed something to soothe his burning, dry throat. His lifeless eyes scanned over the yellowed acrylic sign of the only pharmacy tucked away at the corner of the port intersection. He pushed the glass door open. The wind chimes on the ceiling tinkled, signaling a customer. The air inside was dry and smelled strongly of antibiotics. James stood silently by the door, not bothering to step further inside. Rainwater dripped steadily from his messy hair and clothes onto the white-tiled floor, forming a large puddle. He opened his mouth, about to ask for a cold bottle of water just to snap himself out of it. But right at that moment, a raspy voice, thick with hardship and anxiety, rang out from the cash register, tearing through his eardrums. "Excuse me, miss? Let me get 2 more boxes of ginger tea. My daughter's morning sickness is so bad lately. She throws up everything, even plain porridge. She's just skin and bones now. If this keeps up, I don't know how she's going to keep the baby." James's entire body jolted as if a 10,000-volt current had just shot down his spine. His exhaustion instantly vanished without a trace. Holding his breath, he slowly turned his head toward the glass counter. Standing with her back to him, wearing dark silk clothes speckled with raindrops, was a frail, older woman. Her rough fingers were trembling as she smoothed out crumpled bills to pay for the medicine. There was no mistake, no hallucination this time. It was Diep's mother. James didn't step forward. His chest heaved with heavy, labored breaths. He swallowed hard, trying to ease the dryness in his throat. An overwhelming urge screamed in his mind to rush over, hug the mother, and demand to know where Diep was. But his feet were glued to the floor. The inherent composure of a grown man pulled him back just in time. He knew Diep's personality, and he understood her mother's wariness. If he suddenly showed up right now, panicking and asking questions, it would likely terrify her. She would think his family had found out about the secret. In her panic, she might hide Diep away in an even more remote, darker place. He couldn't risk it again. He had already lost her once. That was the biggest mistake of his life, and he wouldn't allow himself to repeat it. James took a half step back, hiding in the shadows beside the glass display case. He stood there silently, his eyes filled with sorrow as he watched Diep's mother gather her flattened bills to hand to the pharmacist. She carefully wrapped the boxes of ginger tea in 2 plastic bags to keep them dry, then pulled her flimsy disposable raincoat tighter and hurried back out into the pouring rain. The moment her frail back disappeared behind the glass door, James immediately turned on his heel and followed. The late afternoon rain in the fishing village fell steadily. The sky turned a gloomy, depressing gray. Keeping a safe distance, James silently shadowed Diep's mother's hurried footsteps. The paved road of the market gradually faded behind them, replaced by the narrow, winding, and deep alleys of the slum. On both sides were rows of old tin-roofed boarding houses, their walls peeling in large chunks, packed together like dilapidated matchboxes. Rainwater poured from the awnings onto the bumpy concrete road, pooling into muddy puddles. James walked in total silence. His clothes clung freezing cold to his skin, but he barely felt it anymore. His eyes were locked on the frail back swaying in that flimsy raincoat ahead of him. The deeper they went into the alley, the tighter James's heart clenched. Seeing the old mother stumbling in that thin raincoat against the biting wind made his nose sting. The surge of sheer heartbreak in his chest made the proud man's footsteps feel impossibly heavy. After about 15 minutes of trudging through the rain, Diep's mother finally stopped at the end of a dead-end alley. It was a tiny rented room, wedged between two moss-covered brick walls. The old woman took off her soaked disposable raincoat, draped it over the windowsill, and gently pushed the rotting wooden door open to step inside. James stood frozen a few feet away. His heartbeat was slow but incredibly clear, drumming directly against his eardrums. Finally, after months of living in agony and searching in vain, he was standing right here, separated from the woman he loved by nothing but a thin wooden door. He approached carefully. The soles of his leather shoes squished softly against the muddy ground. James stopped by the porch, where a small tin roof blocked some of the blowing rain. Through the crack of the ajar wooden door, a weak, yellowish light from a small bulb spilled out. James held his breath and peeked inside. The room was barely 150 square feet, bare and damp. A rickety bamboo bed sat pushed against the wall, covered with a thin, frayed mattress. And right at the corner of the bed, James's eyes landed on a familiar silhouette. It was Diep. James's throat choked up bitterly. A layer of mist instantly clouded his vision. The tiny woman was bundled in a thin sweater, looking visibly exhausted. Her face was pale and gaunt, completely stripped of the bright, pure glow she used to have. The long hair she usually took such good care of was hastily tied back, with a few loose strands falling against her hollow cheeks. She was sitting with her back against the wall. Her thin hands, covered in faint scratches, were gently resting on her lower belly, which hadn't even begun to show yet. She looked down at her lap with a gaze full of exhaustion, yet carrying the fierce, gentle resilience of a mother. "Diep, have a sip of ginger tea to warm your stomach, honey. You've been throwing up so much your insides can't take it." Her mother's heartbroken voice rang out. She carried a small, steaming plastic cup, walking carefully from the makeshift kitchenette to the bed. Diep looked up at her mother, her pale lips forcing a weak smile to reassure her. "I'm okay, Mom. A few more days of this and I'll be fine. I just feel so bad for you. At your age, having to travel all the way down here to suffer with me." Her voice was paper-thin and weak, blending into the sound of the rain outside. Outside the door, James had to bite his teeth so hard his jaw clenched, desperately trying to swallow back a sob. Every word Diep said was like a needle piercing straight into his bleeding heart. She was always like this, always taking all the hurt and hardship upon herself, always trying to act strong so she wouldn't be a burden to anyone. Why was she so foolish? Why couldn't she understand that the most agonizing thing for him wasn't losing his career, but seeing the woman he loved gritting her teeth and braving the storm entirely alone in this miserable place? His self-control had reached its absolute limit. James couldn't stand on the sidelines of his family's life for another second. He reached out. His large, trembling hand touched the rough surface of the wooden door, and he slowly pushed the dilapidated door wide open. Creak. The sound of the unoiled hinges echoed in the cramped space, startling the two women inside. The dim light from the alley spilled in, casting the shadow of a tall, soaked man standing like a statue right at the threshold. Diep's mother spun around. When she recognized that familiar face, her eyes widened in shock. Crash! The plastic cup slipped from her hands. The hot ginger tea spilled across the cement floor, shattering the quiet of the tiny room. Sitting on the bed, Diep jumped and looked up. In that exact moment, time seemed to stand completely still. The rain outside, the wind howling through the tin roof, every sound in the world vanished. There were only four eyes locked onto each other. Diep was stunned. Her wide eyes were flooded with absolute shock and disbelief. She just sat there, staring blankly at the drenched man in front of her. Her breathing seemed to stop. Her thin hands unconsciously gripped the edge of the blanket. Tears began to well up in her red eyes, out of heartache and out of the helplessness of knowing the strong wall she had built for so long had completely crumbled before him. Seeing James so exhausted and drenched in rain, her heart ached terribly. He stepped slowly into the room. Rainwater dripped from his soaked clothes onto the floor. He didn't care how pathetic he looked right now. His eyes were locked solely on the pale face of the girl trembling on that bamboo bed. He walked up to the side of the bed and slowly dropped to one knee on the cold cement floor, bringing his eyes level with hers. James's chest heaved. He raised his large hand, hesitating in midair for a beat, before slowly and incredibly gently touching Diep's gaunt, ice-cold cheek. The touch was clumsy and trembling, but filled with the utmost devotion. The moment his warmth transferred to her skin, a hot tear, held back for all this time, finally rolled down the proud man's sharp jawline. He looked straight into her tear-filled eyes. His voice was hoarse, deep, and broken with sorrow, yet carrying the weight of an unshakable resolve. How much longer were you planning to hide my child and suffer in this place alone, Diep? Guys, honestly, when reading the scene where James drops to one knee on that cold cement floor, trembling as he touches Diep's gaunt cheek, my own chest tightened right along with him. A man who holds the whole world in the palm of his hands, yet feels so utterly helpless that it brings him to tears. Seeing the woman he loves suffering in such a miserable place. Their love is truly immense, but it's also so deeply heartbreaking. What do you guys think Diep's reaction will be after James's agonizing question at the end of this episode? Will she break down and throw her arms around him? Or will her insecurities and the fear of his father's power make her push his hand away once again? Please pour all your feelings and predictions down in the comments below. I can't wait to read and give a heart to every single one of your thoughts. If today's storyline touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the fateful moment in the next episode. Thank you so much for always being here with me, and I'll catch you all in the next video.